So today's session is on Southeast Asia, or ASEAN. We have four leading experts representing different parts of the education ecosystem, essentially impact, investment, early stage and later stage education companies. So I think we'll get a unique perspective of what's going on in the region. One of the main outcomes or results of this is for you to just have a better understanding of what's going on in Southeast Asia. Just to start, how many people here are looking to enter markets within Southeast Asia with their company? Okay. How many people here are looking to invest in Southeast Asia? Okay, so that gives us an idea. We can tailor some of the questions to accommodate you. Just a bit of a primer and maybe a disclaimer. All of us actually live in Southeast Asia, so we'll probably be a little biased in terms of favoritism towards why we think it's an exciting area and a good place to do business. Southeast Asia, interestingly, over the past about 45 years has tripled in size. So now the 10 countries that make up ASEAN are about 640 million people. In the early 1970s, it was around 130. GDP per capita has grown excessively over time. Infrastructure has improved. It's a youthful population. There's a lot of indicators pointing to why people should do business there. So we'll talk a little bit about that more in detail. But I think to start out, I like to start a little bit broad and maybe not even just focus specifically on education initially, but many people, when they talk about ASEAN, they talk about it from a kind of a uniform perspective. But in actuality, the 10 countries that make up Southeast Asia are very distinct and different. So I think as an opening question, I'd like to ask Sandeep, from an economic perspective, do you think ASEAN is one economic community, or is it a bunch of individualized countries kind of doing their own thing?
So as you said, and you gave me the answer to start with, which is they're different countries and they behave differently, because we think that the socio-economic construct of every country is quite different. I'll speak about 3 or 4 and goes to the history of each economy. We've been investing in Southeast Asia for now 2.5 years, and we've been there for 8 years or so, learning lessons, and took us 5 years to figure out what we should and should not do. And then we went in and started making investments. In the process, we realized that there are 2 continuums. One of them is family orientation. The other one is focus on creating value through capital, right? Those are 2 axes through which every country can be threaded. One of them, let's look at the family orientation. On the one hand, it's Philippines, which is really family oriented, right? And if you go to Philippines to invest, your biggest competitor are the 40 biggest families there. They run the country through privatization of local resources. And you know that when you're entering a new segment, a new market, if you're going to buy something, very likely they'll show up, right? On the other hand, there is Vietnam, which is a country that's come out of a lot of struggle. And while there is family orientation, there is a lot more innovation and a lot more value towards realizing value through capital. And that's very available. And the competition you face in Vietnam is from everybody that's trying to invest in, who is not from Vietnam. And that's very different from what you see in other parts. And the market in Vietnam is highly different from the market in Philippines. So those are the 2 ends, and Thailand and other countries fall in between of the orientations towards family versus capital orientation. That's one example of what we see.
So Young, again, just more kind of from a macro perspective, what kind of trends are you seeing in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because we're Singapore and San Francisco, so kind of seeing the comparisons. And so I think there's a couple of trends that I find very interesting. I think one is, given that when we talk about the millennial workforce in Southeast Asia, a lot of that growth is coming from 18 to 35. So it has the largest population of young people, I think, in the world, right, in terms of where the growth is coming from. So the way that people learn, the way that they engage with technology, obviously is much faster, if you will, than if I compare that to, say, Europe or the US even. So kind of the mobile first thing, it's obvious. Everyone in Southeast Asia is mobile first. No one asks that question.
That's right.
Right? Whereas in, I think in Europe and the US, people are still talking about mobile responsiveness. So that's kind of one thing. I think the second thing, you're seeing a lot of stuff in the employee engagement space. So I think a lot of, I think the companies are evolving and maturing a lot. So you're starting to see companies now focus a lot more on employee experience. And you're seeing that kind of rising train. It's not just about content anymore. It's about the experience of delivery. I think the other thing is, and now I'm biased a little bit by Singapore government, is really a heavy focus on skills. So the whole, and I think that's kind of a global trend, not just unique to Southeast Asia, but I think where I see differences is governments like Singapore are putting their money where their mouth is and literally setting up, a significant amount of capital, giving Singaporean citizens free capital to do continuous online learning and skills building. I think other governments in Malaysia are doing the same thing. So you're starting to see a much more, I would say, not just talk, but a lot of action related to the idea of skill building and upskilling. And I think that's really exciting. It creates a lot of exciting opportunities, both for startups as well as investors.
Interesting. Tuan, your company Topica is one of the, we'll call it the golden childs of Southeast Asia. So your company not only, it started in Vietnam, but now you're in multiple countries. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience taking your company from Vietnam into other markets throughout Southeast Asia?
Yep, thanks, Mike. Yeah, so it's challenging, obviously. It cannot be oversimplified into cultural differences. So what we learn over time is we need to break down the problem of cultural difference into many different things. For example, when you go to a new country, we would divide a project into several phases. There's a first launching phase, and there is a growth and optimization phase. So for launching phase, we will bring people who we know are best at launching and trying out early stage assumptions and hypothesis, and trying out quickly and then fail quickly and get up and go again. So we bring those people into a new country, they set things up, and then typically for growth phase and the later stages, we would hire local people. But there is the challenge usually compounded by the fact that there's no edtech industry in South Asia, no significant edtech industry. So usually banks, they would poach people from another bank. EdTech companies, we don't have that many other EdTech companies to poach people from. So we would have to build a workforce from other industries. So we bring in people from Big Four accounting firms, from consumer firms like P&G and Unilever. We put them through rotational programs, and so that they can learn the products, the culture, and then they get highly motivated, and then we can give them the next big assignment. Yeah, so a lot of different challenges go together.
To put you on the spot slightly, and this is, I guess this is a stereotypical statement, but Vietnam seems to be dominating this investment space in Southeast Asia. I think I saw a statistic where last year it was something like almost 800 million in VC funding into Vietnam, whereas Thailand had around 30. Why is that? What is so unique about Vietnam within Southeast Asia that it's getting so much attention externally as well as internally?
Well, it's everything is relative, right? So we published this annual survey about $800 million flowing to Vietnam. The next day we saw another report that there was 80 billion into China. So that's
so okay.
So our
so
happiness was short.
Yeah.
So I think relatively we did relatively well to other countries in the region. I think one of the reason is that there are a couple of reasons actually. I keep telling people this. Number one is there was a VC fund who came in very early, so we have to thank them a lot. IDG Ventures, they came in like 15 years ago when nobody even knew what venture capital was. There was another reason. There was a telco who helped deregulate the whole telecommunication industry, Viettel, and as a result, every province, every commune get connected with broadband and at a very good price, surprisingly very good price. And the third reason, there is a gaming company of everything. So there's a gaming company that made sure that every village has a gaming room, a internet cafe. Back then, about 15 years ago, because of this gaming company. So interestingly, the combination of three of them, and actually there was another fourth company who helped groom the tech talent industry, FPT.
Right.
So a huge outsourcing company who groomed the tech talent.
It
so
sounds like a unique blend of,
yeah.
that created that. Actually, so your company is based in Singapore, but you've recently entered the Philippine market. Maybe you can share a little bit about what that experience was like as well.
So maybe some context will help. We entered the Philippines for 2 or 3 reasons. We were looking at Indonesia very closely because of the size of the market, Vietnam because everybody talks about Vietnam. But from our perspective, we are in K8 elementary, as you know. Deregulation in our sector, or level of regulation, was one criteria, and Philippines had a large installed base of affordable private schools, which made it interesting, with not too much of government interference or religious interference, which is there in some markets. English, of course, is another big advantage. I mean, I always knew that, but now having spent time in the Philippines, I'm amazed at how entrenched English is, and not just in the Manila area, but well beyond. Of course, not everybody speaks English, but those who do speak it pretty well, and a lot of them do. And a third area was what would be the best springboard from a learning perspective to go to other markets. So I think the scorecard after 2 years being there is that looks like it was a good decision. And of course, we've faced our set of challenges. It's a fairly nationalistic kind of culture, so any foreigner coming in is obviously met with a kind of mixed reception. But going from Singapore was a big strength. Singapore in the region is looked up to as the big brother, as the place which can do no wrong in many ways. So we try to leverage that to the extent we could. And so that was a big strength. I think also the receptivity to new things is very high. So we ran into schools which were like, oh my God, you're building something for the Philippines, which is affordable. And we've been buying things out of Europe and North America. So people are looking for answers. And even Singapore, I mean, relatively speaking, is a rich, expensive country. So solutions relevant to the Philippines. And now as we are beginning to look at countries around, Indonesia and Vietnam, I think the relevance of our experience in the Philippines, including talent. So I forgot to mention, I think Philippines as a source of talent is underestimated, I think, in the region. And to take kind of one reference point, people talk a lot about India in another context, and we've done a lot of work in India. The program we run head-to-head in India versus the Philippines, the quality of implementation in the Philippines is superior to what's happening in India. So in terms of picking out talent from the Philippines and taking to other markets in the region, we also see possibility there. So many wins, a lot of things to pick up from there.
I think also, as ASEAN becomes more integrated, we'll be seeing a lot more kind of internal mobility within the region, but also from the business perspective in terms of setting up businesses from country to country, like Tuan's company has done. Sandeep, you own several companies, and I think you've gone through that process yourself in terms of regulation, country to country, adhering to regulation. Can you share a little bit about that experience?
I think the experience of just operating businesses in Southeast Asia has to be pretty exciting because every country has different regulations, from tax filings to setting up a company to organizing boards, what corporate governance means in every country, what are the general practices, how the board acts within the board members, what's accepted in a founder's mentality versus not. There are pretty unique differences across each country. However, I think as you look at EdTech or key elements of investable segments of education are generally run by individuals who have seen a lot more than their own country, generally. They've transplanted themselves into that country, normally after having worked abroad or studied abroad. And the culture we find is the culture of innovation and entrepreneurship across the board, across all countries pretty much, except in the very core segments of education, like running a school or running a college. And there the regulations across the board are Today, of the nature of saying, do we empower a college to find the best license, or do we drive towards quality? This is the struggle between quality versus authorizing coursework. So most of Southeast Asia is still towards authorizing coursework and towards granting licenses in core of education, and has not migrated towards assessments or assessment of quality of institutions. So that's the education regulation aspect, and every country has its own nuance of what's for profit, what's not for profit. But surprisingly, no country is business unfriendly. They're all, the 5 key countries have different levels of focus on bringing in capital, and along with bringing in good quality entrepreneurship, particularly in segments such as education.
So Young, so your company also based in Singapore, you've been there for quite a while. Maybe just run for our audience that's looking to enter the region, I think that's something everybody considers, is which country should I set up in first, and typically it's Hong Kong or Singapore for Asia in general, but you've chosen Singapore. Maybe you can share a little bit about your experience on why you chose Singapore and what are the advantages of doing so. Not necessarily a plug for the Singaporean government, so to speak, but just tell us a little bit about why Singapore maybe is the unique landing spot.
Sure, Mike. The interesting thing is, because Nobi's my second company, right? And I actually started it in San Francisco. And so I think for many of you who are looking at going into Southeast Asia, I literally then said, given the market and where I thought the innovation and openness to ideas, similar to what you're saying, the openness to innovation, where do I want to kind of build my product, do the testing, and in a really kind of in a market that would allow us to grow globally. And so, we were pretty strategic, and we said we evaluated Singapore, Hong Kong, because we were open to being anywhere actually in the region. And if you take the Singapore-Hong Kong conversation, which many people debate, there were a few reasons why we thought Singapore would be a much better market for us. And I think now a couple of years down the road, I think it was still the right decision. So I think one is you have the predominance of English. I think many people don't know that Singapore is predominantly an English-speaking country. So you can do business in English unless you want to speak some Singlish. So those, if you want to learn Singlish along the way, you can. But predominantly, you can use English, which is a little bit different from Hong Kong. You have a lot of foreigners in Hong Kong, but I think now with China, it's becoming much more Chinese. And I think that the prevalence of China, as there's been a lot of shifts culturally in terms of openness, et cetera. I think also there's just a lot of support, and a lot of the MNCs and depending on your target client. So for us, it's corporates. So the headquarters of a lot of the American companies, whether it's the banks, whether it's the professional services firms like the KPMGs or the banks of the world, they're actually headquartered either in Singapore or Hong Kong. And a lot of them in Singapore. So you have a lot of the key decision making for the ASEAN region happening out of Singapore. So within a few blocks within the central business district, you'll get access to your potential clients. I think from an investment perspective as well, there's a lot more maturity. I don't know I think you probably have the numbers in terms of Hong Kong edtech investments versus Singapore. The investors are in Singapore, the vast majority, and also the ecosystem. And I think largely, and this is maybe a plug for you, Mike, but I mean, largely what you've done is bring together an ecosystem. And so I think there's a growing ecosystem now of edtech founders and investors, as well as companies. So I think Singapore is kind of that connecting ground. And then you do have the government support. So as we're moving into different markets, there's just tremendous openness to foreigners. They don't care that you're not from the region. And so compared to, say, Philippines or Indonesia, Vietnam, right? True. I'm American, so it's easy for me to be in Singapore as opposed to other markets. And there is a lot of actually funding support, even if you're American. So you don't have to be Asian or from that region to get the funding support that you need. And they're very open, so they're constantly looking for innovative new ideas, from government down to corporate, super open to that. And I've never seen a country that is that open, actually, in terms of funding, resource support. Literally any country in the world we want to go to, they have an office or have someone who's going to help us with that and provide us with the tax and regulatory kind of advice, which is pretty awesome, especially if you're a startup kind of growing.
Very, very welcoming and progressive, and
super.
And essentially the Bank of Southeast Asia as well. It's one. So we're gonna talk a little bit about education, just like specific on education now. I think you mentioned earlier that there's really no dominant key player like in Southeast Asia at the moment.
Sorry, say that again?
There's no dominant key player in the education space in Southeast Asia. If anyone it will take that place, I think potentially it could be your company. Could you talk and share a little bit about kind of your vision on where you want to take your company throughout the region? And you also have differentiated your company as opposed to other companies that are just focused on one core product or service. You've done a really good job of differentiating Topica into different product lines and services. So if you could maybe share about your vision of how you see your company kind of engaging in the region in the next 5 years, that would be interesting.
I mean, thank you for the vote of confidence. And, we, as I mentioned, so international expansion is always challenging. So we try to be pragmatic. So we're going to focus ourselves on 3 or 4 key markets, the largest population. So Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So the 3 or 4. And in terms of products, I think there is a huge. So our key vision is to be the Amazon for quality education. Mm-hmm. So on one side, we want to expand our customer base. So currently about 2 million paying customers. Expand that multi-fold with free content, free apps, so that we can generate massive traffic onto the sites. And then we, on the other hand, we can leverage because we have one of the longest experience in the edtech sector, about 10 years, developing efficacy, retention. Mm-hmm. So our online degree program have about 90% retention rate over 12 months, which we are very proud of. So we gonna leverage that into retaining students and increasing efficacy. Mm-hmm. So, but this is a huge sector, a huge market. There's so many things to do. So what we also plan to do is to help other companies with seed funding, with advisor, Zori works, so that they can build a very good product. Mm-hmm. And of course, there is sales interest in that because which product we can also distribute in our platform. So that's the grand vision. Yeah.
So that's kind of on the business side in terms of expansion. Ashish, in terms of addressing core issues in education within the region, I think your company is very directed towards that. Maybe you could just comment a little bit about how you're addressing core issues in education and maybe what your vision is as well for entering other markets, selected markets in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I think one thing that's common to the region, and if I was to extend that to South Asia as well, is disproportionate number of investments and education and edtech action is around serving the top 10% of the population. Mm-hmm. And that translates into primarily in the B2C sector in test prep or test prep plus kind of solutions. Mm-hmm. And in the B2B sector in what I call relationship type businesses, where you've got the relationship with either the district or the school owner or the network, and you're plugging in products. Now what that does is, and we've seen this across the board, is that the motivation to innovate out of this is actually quite low. Mm-hmm. The motivation is more in what I call the milking models, where you want to optimize that model and get more out of it. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of examples of that. So the approach we are taking is, in that sense, kind of a little bit off the main street, where we want to go for the underdog, the lower middle class and middle class students in non-privileged settings. And the opportunity which we have found is that non-government affordable private schools is a very interesting opportunity. Had we gone to government schools or public schools in most of these markets, it would have been very difficult to penetrate, A, and B, to penetrate with an innovation would have been even harder. Mm-hmm. Whereas these mom and pop store style schools are very large in number, they're open to solutions, they're open to innovation, and we're getting the opportunity to serve a different kind of audience. Mm-hmm. And I think each market has its own kind of peculiarity around it. Philippines has these low-income type of schools, which has a lot of the overseas foreign workers' children coming. So very often you have this case of the dad is a driver in Dubai, mom is working in Hong Kong or in Singapore as domestic help. The kids live with the grandmom, but they want them to go to a private school because they feel that it'll be that much better education than going to a public school. But these schools need help. So what we are finding is that if you're able to find the right kind of market source and have an innovative solution, of course with the intention to make an impact, otherwise you'll kind of end up in this gravitate to the low-hanging fruit. The opportunity is there. It exists, and we're seeing the result.
So I think Southeast Asia, like much of emerging markets, is very focused on education which is going to give immediate value, right? It is not for the purpose of just a degree, which is great, but the biggest opportunities are really in providing affordable, good quality education across the board. So the value of, at the higher education level, of a degree program or a certification program that gets you to a job quickly is useful. So let me give you an example. If you are examining a 4-year college in the US that generally imparts a degree which has got elements of core skills like reading, writing, and we speak about those core skills at the very basis of an economic setup of society. In many Southeast Asian economies where the affordability is sub $1,000 a year fee level and around $500 to $800, getting to anything beyond frills, anything beyond just the core education, providing no frills education is the only choice. And there, you've got to innovate. You've got to innovate with number of teachers who can teach a number of classrooms at a time. You've got to teach to provide the best curriculum, a lot of which is developed through the teachers themselves and their passion. And you've got to provide even support in areas such as financial support. You've got to see the children through. You've got to provide them emotional support because often they are not supported at home. And so it's an entire social effort at that scale. And then it's got huge rewards in terms of what you see them achieving. And you generally don't end up providing courses such as atomic physics or other things which are great for learning but don't get you a job. The courses that work in many of these countries will be like accounting, criminal justice, nursing, other medical sciences. At the core of it all, if you separate, and the second area is the infusion of English language is a huge opportunity, except Philippines, right? In Vietnam and Thailand, you can build a significant business by providing affordable, high quality, measurable English language. And that leads to confidence, that leads to opportunity to understand and enter a new market. And parents will pay an inordinate amount. I am shocked how much parents pay in Thailand and in Vietnam. And a lot of parents, I think, end up working 3 jobs, 2 jobs and a half, and have a small business. It's endless. And they have 2 kids, and they're both getting the best English language education. And of course, Topica has done a good job in providing English language as well. And there are other companies as well which have done a great job. So those are great areas of growth. At the school level, of course, affordable private schools are exciting, but then there are other models which are very exciting as well. What does a child's day look like in school in a Southeast Asian country, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines? Generally, that school day is 6 to 8 hours long. It doesn't really end at the school. Students end up going for supplemental learning. And in Singapore, it is incredible where every child has 3 or 2 supplemental learning opportunities after school, and children's days go for 10 hours a day. So it is a very competitive society, all of Southeast Asia, and the ability and desire to spend is not commensurate with the stated income. You just cannot correlate, wow, you make so little theoretically, but you spend so much. It boggles your mind. You spend 50% of the theoretical income.
Very, almost similar to China in some respect, and I think it's irrespective of the, like as you say, the earnings of the parents. So if they make a lot more, they're just spending a lot more on tutors. They get a more expensive piano teacher, whatever. So that parental spend is huge, similar. Go ahead.
No, can I just build off on the skill? Because I think one of the things that I also find different, in Southeast Asia versus, let's say, US or Europe, is actually the focus on skills. And in some ways, because some of the degrees are not, just because you hire someone with a degree, you can't assume the same level of even English writing skills and communication skills. And it's been one of my biggest challenge, honestly. I can hire a college grad in Singapore, and I can't assume that they write well. And in fact, 8 out of 10 don't write well. So in terms of skill building, and I think because of that, you have to really focus on skills now. And so skills is really the new currency. And so now you're seeing these, and it's about accredited skills, not just skills because there's just too much choice. So I think that that's where there's a big emphasis now on figuring out what are the skills that are required, both technical skills, soft skills is actually the big thing now. How do you develop these soft skills? People are graduating now with all these degrees, but they can't, the creativity, communication skills, some of the critical thinking skills are very are lacking. So then how do you develop that and also have evidence that those skills have actually been attained? And that's been a big focus in terms of some of the stuff that we're seeing and the stuff that we're investing in, because it's no longer enough just to have that piece of paper.
Right.
You have to have some kind of recognition with your accreditation and the emphasis. We fought the assessment thing for like the first 2 years. We're like, we're not going to do assessments because true learning cannot be measured through an assessment score. But we lost that battle because in Asia they said, I need to have an assessment, I need to have a score, and if you can do behavior stuff, awesome. But I think that there's this growing understanding and acceptance that it's insufficient to have an assessment score because the employers are demanding more. And so you're starting to see this gap between that assessment score and then what the companies are looking for employability. Right. And so how do you close the gap to employability? Yeah.
I think that's pretty common on different levels in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So something, kind of a common thing, a lot of you have just kind of alluded to innovation. Fostering creativity. Singapore does a pretty good job. Obviously, they score well on PISA and have a good school system. But So Young, I think you travel a lot. You see a lot of different companies and regions, and Sandeep as well. Have you seen any interesting, innovative education companies basically come out of Southeast Asia? And then, Tuan, this will also be good for you. There was an article in World Economic Forum published a report on an index ranking the most innovative cities in the world. Bangalore was #1, and it was innovative in terms of responsiveness to change. But #2, which surprised everyone, was Ho Chi Minh. So there's a lot of startups going to Ho Chi Minh, early stage stuff. So Vietnam has also pretty much kind of solidified itself as the innovation, I don't want to say innovation capital of Southeast Asia, but even people in Singapore kind of look towards what's going on in Vietnam. So maybe we can get both of your perspectives on just interesting innovation that you're seeing coming out of those two areas.
You want to talk about Vietnam? I don't know much about Vietnam, but I think in terms of Singapore, I think you're seeing. Because I'm not in K-12, I focus much more on kind of the corporate innovation space.
Correct.
And so it's more like HR tech. So kind of like the HR tech meets ed tech. And where we're seeing, I think, a lot of the innovation is in almost like the crossovers, that it's not limited just to one area. Like even kind of your fintech meeting ed tech, InsurTech meetings. So you're starting to see a lot of this kind of thing happening, which I think is interesting. So we've created these arbitrary lines in terms of the tech community. And I think even things we've talked about is how do we think about the ed tech community, not just being limited to K-12, but kind of a broader conversation about capability and skills. So I think you're starting to see a lot more kind of startups coming into Singapore, even from Finland. So on the education side, coming in from Finland and taking their models, bringing them into Asia, and using Singapore as that launch pad in order to test those concepts out. And I think it's a fantastic market for testing and really assessing product market fit.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, sure. So I think some of the most interesting companies we seen so far is one of them is the name Elsa. So that's a very interesting AI app for pronunciation practice. So you can just talk into the phone and it gives you a grade and corrects your pronunciation. Invested by Google AI, which I think it speaks a lot about the business potential as well as the algorithm and the data, the potential to collect great data for Google. So I would bet that it's very likely that the Google would acquire them soon, and then get all the data, which is very valuable. The second one is Got It, also a very well-known name. So they started as an education app, but now it's become what they call knowledge as a service. So you're working on an Excel sheet, you stuck, you can get an expert to help you within minutes, live expert to help you with that. And obviously, both of them invest a lot in AI. And if you look a little broader, so from one of the most interesting companies I've seen last year from China is Squirrel AI.
Yes.
So I was very impressed with the data they published. So they actually, the adaptive learning algorithm they have actually beat human teachers by several times in terms of learning efficacy. The number of learning units that the class can actually absorb and pass within a given time.
We just have a few minutes left. So given that a lot of our audience is looking to enter markets in Southeast Asia, really quick, if we can go, we'll do like a fire round. One nugget of advice for people entering Southeast Asia. So yeah, if you can start, we'll just go down the line.
Sure.
One nugget, one piece of advice to help people on their journey as they enter Southeast Asian markets.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, Asia is all about relationships as well. So invest the time, resource to build relationships with folks who are on the ground, who've been there. People are very willing to help. And so I think there's no, I think it's a very collaborative, actually, ecosystem. So that's really positive if you're entering. So definitely invest in relationships.
Find a local partner, distribution partner, and of course, talk to everyone you know, but of course, we can also help. We got about 2 million paying customers in Vietnam and Thailand.
Yeah, I think just extending what they're saying, move to Southeast Asia if you want to do business over there, or bring your founder mentality to Southeast Asia. If you're not the founder, find a founder there, and that'll help.
Have to
Okay.
find a partner, yes, I think that's ideal. But chances are if you're innovating and disrupting, you might have to show proof of concept yourself. Second, leverage Singapore. Singapore is different from everybody else in the region, and there's merit in using that to your advantage.
I think this was the Singapore, we should have retitled the session. Welcome to Singapore. Rising Tigers of Southeast Asia, essentially, again, collectively, 630 million people. If you look economically, it's behind China and India, so it's up there. And I think given that most of the population of that 630 million people is probably around mid-20s, there's a lot of growth to expect in the coming years. So that concludes our session for today. And please, if you have any questions, we'll hang around for a few minutes and talk with you.
All right, man. Okay.